we can move on to our first talk, which will be given by Nadine Dijkstra, who will talk about distinguishing imagination from perception in the human brain.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about a very specific type of conscious experience, which is the difference between seeing something and imagining something in your mind's eye. And my research program is really trying to figure out what in the brain is different between the two and what determines whether when we see something we know it's real and when we think it's imagined. The outline of today's talk is as follows. I'll start by introducing the problem that is there, which is the fact that we use the same brain areas to imagine something and to see something. So this leads to a potential for confusion between the two. The next part is about how we can investigate this confusion in the lab. And the idea is that we want to generate situations where people mistake their imagery for perception or vice versa, so that we can isolate the subjective experience of reality. Does this feel real or imagined from the actual reality? Is it actually real or imagined? And then we can kind of zone into the neural correlates that determine the subjective experience instead of the actual reality. And then I'll spend most of today's talk discussing some empirical findings that we have for this specific solution, which we call the reality threshold model, for how we determine the difference between imagery and perception. And I'll end with a recent neuroimaging study where we found neural substrates of this model. Now, I think the idea is that questions are held at the end, but if anything's unclear during the talk, feel free to just put your hand up and ask. So, when I arrived here this morning at this beautiful building, how did my brain know that what I was seeing was really there and I wasn't just imagining being there? That's the question that I want to address today. So when perceiving in the outside world, initially objects will send light waves to your retina, which then translates this into neural signals that are sent to the visual cortex in a bottom-up fashion. But we now know it's abundantly clear that perception is not just a bottom-up process, right? Usually signals from the outside world are quite unclear and degraded, and there's often no one-to-one mapping between what's coming into our eyes and the actual causes of things in the outside world. So we now think that the brain solves this problem by combining prior knowledge with incoming sensory input to infer the most likely cause of our sensory activity, right? So our perception of reality is an inference about sensory activity. So far, so good. So this is something that's demonstrated quite clearly in these types of images. So I assume most of you will readily recognize this as a car and this is a person, right? Kind of obvious. But actually, these are exactly the same blob. They're just oriented differently, but they're exactly the same shape. But still, when you look at this image over here, it really looks like this is a car and this is a person. So your subjective experience of the one thing as a car and the other thing as a person is fully determined by your prior knowledge about scenes and where objects belong in different scenes. And it seems that this is implemented in the brain by top-down signals from the rest of the brain influencing this sensory processing. And this is demonstrated by many different studies, but one of my favorites is this one. So in this study, they trained participants to associate a specific auditory cue with a specific grating. So every time they heard this tone, they would see this grating stimulus. Which means that after a while, when they heard the grating, they really expected, or when they heard the tone, they really expected to see the grating. And then what these researchers did is they trained a decoding on a separate grating localizer. Are you guys familiar with decoding analysis before I get into this? Who is not familiar with decoding? No, there's some. Not, okay, so the idea of training a decoder on this kind of grating localizer is that now we have a model of how the brain processes this visual information. So you can think about the decoder as a kind of representation of the sensory signals of these gratings. And we can then use this decoder to look at brain activity in different instances to see to what extent we see similar neural signatures that would also be present when you are seeing that, when you're actually looking at that grating. So they tested this localizer during a task to see whether this expectation of this tone influenced the processing of the upcoming stimulus. And what they found was indeed that when you are seeing something that you are expecting, so as a valid expectation, you get an increase in decoding accuracy, which just means that your sensory processing is more efficient, better, more accurate. So this is kind of in line with predictive processing theories. But when I saw this was research done at the Donders in the Netherlands, which is where I was doing my PhD, I was more interested in this bit over here. So this suggests that there's a difference in sensory signals between when you expect to see one grating versus the other grating. And remember, this is sensory signal, so it suggests that there's representations of this stimulus present in the brain before anything is on the screen. So I wanted to investigate to what extent does something similar happen when we just imagine something? Does the sensory cortex, the visual cortex, reflect what we are imagining, even when nothing is out there in the world? So that's what we wanted to investigate. In this specific study, we used a retro cue design, which is also something that's been used quite a lot for working memory. So in these kinds of designs, participants are presented with two stimuli, one after the other. So in this case, a face and a house, which is then followed by a retro cue. And the retro cue indicates whether the participants have to imagine this is the first stimulus that they saw or the second stimulus that they saw. They were then presented with a blank screen and had to imagine the cued stimulus as vividly as possible while keeping their eyes open. So this image was not presented, there was nothing on the screen, they just had to kind of mentally project the stimulus that we just presented to them. So this allows us to have a really good control over what people are imagining. And then what we did is we trained our decoder on activity during the perception of these stimuli, and we investigated whether we could use this decoder to guess what people were imagining. So can we cross decode between image and perception? And the idea is that if we can do that significantly above chance, then that means that the brain activity during imagery is similar to the brain activity during perception. That kind of makes sense? Yeah.
Why are you calling that imagination and not memory?
That's a very good question. So for me, the imagery part is the subjective experience of seeing something in your mind's eye that's not actually present. And I think imagery is also involved in certain kinds of memory, but you can also remember something without having a mental image.
The interesting part about memory, imagination, is when you think of something that you hadn't just seen before.
Well, that's not the interesting part to me. So my research is really about how does the brain determine this difference in phenomenology between mentally seeing something in your mind's eye or seeing something in reality. That's the focus. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
So I know if the sort of interpretation already clicked on in both cases.
The interpretation is clicked on in both cases?
In both cases, the visual cortex being activated when seeing or imagining. So sort of interpretation module is seen.
Yeah, so I actually think that the interpretation model that we use during perception is imagery, is the same top-down mechanisms that we use to generate mental images. There's some evidence for that, but it's very detailed, so I'm not going to talk about that a lot, but that's a really good question. Yeah, so what did we find? So again, here, this is an MEG study, so we used MEG, so we have information over time. 0 is the time when the retro cue came on the screen, so this is when people knew which one they had to imagine. And indeed, we were able to significantly cross the code between perception and imagery, suggesting that when people were imagining these faces and houses, very similar neural representations became active as when they were actually seeing these faces and houses. We also did an fMRI study, version of this study, 1 second, and what we found was that this overlap was mostly driven by high-level visual areas, but also some frontal parietal overlap, and most interestingly to consciousness researchers, the subjective vividness of participants' imagery modulated the extent of the overlap in early visual regions. So if your imagery is more vivid, your activity in your early visual cortex is more perception-like.
Can I just ask what the y-axis is in the left?
Decoding accuracy.
High accuracy.
Oh, it's different from chance, so 55.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a good question. All right, so that's all good and well, but that kind of leads to a problem. Because given that imagery and perception are both associated with activity in the visual cortex, and given that our perception of reality is an inference on this activity, how does the brain determine whether this sensory activity reflects reality or imagination? You know, at any given moment in time, the sensory activity in your brain, in your visual cortex, could be imagined, could be real, and how does the brain distinguish between the two? And this is the question that's kind of at the core of my lab in London at the moment. So to investigate this, it's not enough to just compare activity during imagery and perception, right? Because then we have a confound, which is whether or not activity is coming in. And we don't know whether this difference between bottom-up input is actually relating to differences in the experience. right? Because there's also cases where people experience something as real, even though it's actually imagined, like when you're dreaming or during hallucinations. So ideally what we want to do is decouple the bottom-up input from the experience. So we want to create situations where what's coming into our eyes is the same, but in the one case, we think it's imagined, and in the other case, we think it's real. And then we can really isolate the neural correlates that are responding to this subjective difference. All right, so that's something that I tried to figure out how to do. And this was in the pandemic, so I had a lot of time to read a lot of old papers. And that's when I came across this paper by Mary Cheeves West Perkey in 1910. She did not publish under her first name. We can all think about why that might be the case. Mary in 1910, I don't know. But who of you is familiar with the Perkey effect? That's like a couple of nerds over here. No. Cool. So I'll walk you through the experiment. It's really cool. It's one of my favorite studies ever done. So what Mary did is she asked her participants to come to the lab, sit in a chair, and then look at a specific location on a blank wall. So for example, over there, and then project, mentally imagine specific objects on that location. So for example, people were asked to imagine an apple and then to describe what they were experiencing. So you're imagining this apple on this wall, and you're saying, oh, I see this round reddish circle, etc. You're just kind of describing your experience. Now what she did is she secretly hid away this magic projection lantern, and then she used this to project congruent sensory shapes at exactly the same location. So in the case of when participants were imagining an apple, she would present this red circle very faintly at the same location. But participants did not know that she was doing this, right? And what happened was people were like, wow, my imagination is so vivid. I didn't know I could do this. But, I've never really tried, so thank you for showing me that I have really vivid imagination. If I hadn't known I was imagining, I would have thought this was real. So that's really striking, right? Because actually, in reality, these signals are real. They are coming into their eyes, but participants think that they are imagined, suggesting that you can generate these confusions. Now, replication of the Perkey effect has been a bit wobbly, and this obviously was not like a super well-controlled study. 1910, it was like a handful of participants, it was all anecdotal, there were no stats. So we wanted to come up with a more psychophysics modern version of this experiment. And the problem is, it seems essential that people don't know that real stimuli are presented to them, right? But if you do standard psychophysics, you do hundreds and hundreds of trials, and if a participant notices a stimulus on one trial, they're going to expect it on all future trials, so all the rest of your experiment is kind of ruined. So we were like, okay, how can we deal with this? And then we came up with this one trial psychophysics study. So the idea is that we only do one trial per participant, or we do it online, so we can collect hundreds and hundreds of participants, which function as trials in that case. So it allows us to get enough statistical power. And this is what it looked like. I know we had gratings, it's really boring, but it allows us to really control the imagery quite well, which we think is important for generating these confusions. So participants were asked to imagine a left or right as a grating while looking at dynamic noise. So it's like TV static, and they were asked to imagine a grating appearing within this noise. And then they had to rate their imagery on a scale from 1 to 5 in terms of vividness. So after every trial, we asked them, how vividly did you manage to imagine this grating? They did this for a few trials in a row. And then on the critical trial, the last trial, we secretly faded in a grating that was either congruent or incongruent to the one they were imagining. Again, we asked them their imagery vividness. So from the participants' perspective, this trial is the same as all trials before that. But then after that, we were like, hey, on the last trial, did you see a real grating, or was anything you saw only imagined? So this is what it looks like, just to give you an idea. So please imagine this grating within the noise. You all got it? Try to imagine it as vividly as you possibly can. Yeah, keep imagining it, keep imagining it. Vivid grating. Oh. So yeah, it was there, right? So this was above threshold because I wanted to like demonstrate this, but in the actual experiment we presented these gratings like super threshold, so it's really hard to tell. So you can really imagine how people get confused, right? That like, am I imagining it? Is it real? Now we can generate hypotheses about how we think the brain distinguishes between imagery and perception based on simple signal detection theory models. So let me walk you through it. Our first hypothesis is that Perkey's experiment was a fluke. The neural overlap that we found is maybe just I don't know, some kind of confound of neuroimaging, which is not precise enough, and actually there's no problem. So actually my research program is nonsense. It's always good to have your first hypothesis be that. So according to this hypothesis, we just have separate populations for perception and imagery. And our imagery populations determine the vividness ratings. So in our experiment, when people said how vivid their imagery was, it's determined by an imagery population. And whether or not participants detected the stimulus on the last trial is just determined by a different perception population. So if that would be the case, we would expect to see something like this, where the percentage of reality judgments on the last trial is the same for congruent or incongruent conditions, because it doesn't matter if the imagery is overlapping with the perception. And also, we wouldn't expect to see a relationship between these vividness ratings and these reality judgments. But if it was working in a more interesting way, we could expect to see one of two patterns. So the first interesting hypothesis we came up with was based on Perkew's findings. And it's this idea that if you're imagining, you know that you are imagining often, right? So this intention to imagine could be used to tag any activity that's in line with your imagery intention to be imagined. So if you're imagining an apple, you're like, all apple activity is imagined because I am imagining it. Does that make sense? So this intention can be used as a signal to tag this sensory activity. And we can model this very simply by adding a suppressive connection between imagery and perception, such that when they are in line, when they are congruent, you're less likely to say that what you see is real. So this is what the simulation would come out, which is kind of what we said intuitively. Your reality judgment should be lower in the congruent condition than in the incongruent condition, because in the congruent condition, you ascribe them to your imagery. You ascribe these perceived ratings to be the consequence of your imagination. And we also expect to find this interesting connection between these vividness ratings, because according to this model, only when your imagery is not vivid enough would a stimulus cross this threshold and be perceived as real. So only if this suppression is not strong enough to explain away the perception signal would you think it's real. So I mean, it's a bit of detail, but these models really allow us to make some kind of counterintuitive predictions sometimes. So this is the pattern that we would expect according to this model. Now, there's another thing that we thought could work, and that's just very simple. When you imagine something, even though it seems similar to perceiving reality, it's a lot less vivid, right? So close your eyes, imagine a red apple. Who of you would say this is as vivid as really seeing an apple? No, right? Who of you would say, like, it's kind of vivid, but definitely less vivid than an actual apple? Yeah. And who of you would say, well, it's really vague, it's like fuzzy, nothing's really there? And who of you would say, like, I don't know, I'm just thinking about an apple, I'm not seeing anything? You might have Asian taste, yeah? So anyway, but in general, the experience is a lot less vivid, right? I think people would agree on that. Yes? That's a good question. Philosophers and scientists have argued about this for decades. So usually when people use these questions as they ask, is it as vivid as real seeing? That's the maximum. And then only an idea is the minimum. And then you kind of go somewhere in between. I agree, it's imperfect. Yeah, there's a lot there. I totally agree. I think it's an imperfect measure. But it's kind of the best we have now. But some people are working on actually trying to figure out, like, can we measure contrast of mental images? Can we measure detailness? Like, really, like, try to get a bit better at that. But it's hard because you don't have the ground truth, right? That's the annoying thing. But yeah, so the other hypothesis is actually, we don't have to do all this fancy tagging of sensory activity, because usually when you imagine something, the activity is just lower than when you perceive something, because it's less vivid. And this is also in line with what we find in the brain. Usually when people imagine something, even though you get activity in the visual cortex, it's generally a lot lower than when they actually perceive something. And the way we can model this is saying, image and perception, they activate the same neural population, yes, but it doesn't lead to confusion, because imagery by itself is usually not strong enough to cross a reality threshold. It's only that when you get perceptual bottom-up input that the activity gets strong enough to actually cross this threshold. And if that's the case, we would expect to see exactly the opposite. Namely, that in the congruent condition, when imagery and perception are the same, you get stronger activation, so you're more likely to think it's real. And counterintuitively, when you think something is real, you have to say your imagery is more vivid, because the vividness is also determined by the same activity. So both imagery vividness ratings and reality judgments are based on the same underlying signal. So they can't be distinguished. So even when we're asking people to rate the vividness of their imagery, they can't help but rate the vividness of their total sensory experience. So, I mean, I kind of told you what it was already in the introduction by saying I'm going to present evidence over a reality threshold model the whole time. So that's indeed exactly what we found, which is in line with this reality threshold model. So people were more likely to say they saw a real stimulus when they were imagining the same one as they were presented with, and the reality judgments co-varied with the vividness rating, specifically in the congruent condition. Now we wanted to see, okay, can this also explain cases where people hallucinate when they think that what they're imagining is real? So we did another experiment, which is basically the same as this one, but just we didn't show a stimulus on the last trial. But again, we asked people, hey, on the last trial, was a real stimulus presented? Or was everything you saw imagined? So you'll get some cases where people think that they saw a real stimulus, even though nothing was there. And according to this model, these instances have to be associated with an increase in imagery vividness, right? Because that's the thing that distinguishes the two according to the model. And that's indeed what we found. So this suggests that maybe the way in which the brain keeps apart imagery and perception is based on the vividness or the sensory strength of activation. Usually this works pretty well. Usually our experience of imagery is less vivid than our experience of perception, and this is a pretty solid way to keep the two apart. It's only in rare circumstances when imagination for some reason becomes so vivid that we can't distinguish it from perception. So the next part here is to investigate how this is implemented in the brain. Is that okay, or does anybody have any questions about the modeling bit before I continue? I'm also a bit conscious of time. Okay, I'll get going. So the first thing we needed to do was figure out if we can also do this study in a multi-trial way, because we can't really do one trial per participant in an fMRI study, because that's very expensive and very labor intensive. So we came up with the following experimental design, which is pretty similar to the one I just explained to you. But now participants were aware that stimuli might be presented to them on each trial. So in every trial, they imagined a grating and simultaneously had to indicate, kind of look for an external grating to see whether or not it was presented. So the imagery and perception was either congruent or incongruent, and every trial was associated with a reality judgment or a detection judgment. Was the stimulus presented, yes or no? And then how vivid was your imagery? That's the basic design. And we did this in an MRI scanner, and the data were collected by this really talented master student, Thomas van Rijn, who got a neuron paper out of his master's thesis. So that's pretty good. Pretty good for him. So we first wanted to make sure that our model could still explain the behavior in this multi-trial experiment. So just to walk you very briefly through these model simulations, our null model says that these detection judgments are based on a separate perception signal, and the vividness ratings are based on a separate imagery signal. So if that would be the case, then we would expect that the reality judgments are only influenced by whether or not there is actually a stimulus presented on the screen, not by your imagery. So you would only expect to see a main effect of stimulus presence, and you wouldn't expect to see any interaction of whether or not external stimuli would be present on your vividness ratings, because they would just be different things. Our reality threshold model instead says no, both of these judgments are based on the same underlying signal, which is a combination between perception and imagery. And this signal, which we call the reality signal, that's just my supervisor at the time thought that sounded cool, but you can think about it as like a sensory strength signal or like a total sensory activity signal. So this reality signal is determined by both perception and imagery, and when they are congruent to each other, the signal is higher, so you're more likely to make a reality judgment. So there's an increase for congruency compared to incongruency. And also we expect to find this interaction between stimulus presence and congruency, such that your imagery becomes more vivid when we show a congruent stimulus as well. Right? This is a subtle effect that you also expect to see there. And that's exactly what we find. So very much in line with this reality threshold model, we did some model fitting, which also showed this model to be a better fit. And then another thing that this model really predicts is that reality judgments should be related to vividness ratings only in the congruent condition, because only in the congruent condition are they actually about the same signal. I always do this. So we tested that as well, and that's indeed what we find. So when there's no stimulus present, but people still say that they see a stimulus, so that's a false alarm. That imagery is more vivid, is higher than when they say that the stimulus wasn't there, and the same when the stimulus is there, and this is only the case for the congruent and not the incongruent condition. So by this time we're convinced, okay, this model explains the behavior well enough. So now we can look into the brain to see if we find any signatures of this underlying hypothesized signal, the sensory strength signal. Where is it coming from, right? Other people, that's a whole different. We first wanted to look in the brain, inside people's brains, where this was coming from. So the first thing we would expect the signal to do is to co-vary both with vividness ratings as well as the reality judgments, right? Because we're saying this is basically determining both how vivid your experience is and whether or not you think something is real. So we just first did a parametric modulation whole brain analysis to see which brain areas are modulated by these reality judgments and these vividness ratings. And these are the brain areas that we found. So what's important to note is that even though we found behavioral correlations between the two, especially in the congruent condition, the regressors themselves were actually, they're not entirely orthogonal, but they were not super correlated. So we don't think that any overlap here is due to collinearity. But instead, we seem to find that, especially in the back of the brain, so in the visual cortex, these high-level visual regions, the fusiform gyrus in the ventral stream and the interparietal sulcus in the dorsal stream, both of these regions are involved in determining or co-vary with the vividness of your experience and also with whether or not you think a real stimulus is presented to you, which is in line with the model. So we thought, okay, maybe these regions encode this kind of combined sensory strength signal. So in order to really further investigate this, we kind of fitted the model to behavior and then extracted this latent reality signal from the model in the different conditions to see what kind of pattern we would expect to see for a signal that does this computational thing. So this signal should have both a main effect of stimulus presence and a main effect of congruency. And it should also co-vary with vividness and reality judgments in a very specific way, such that the activity would be lowest when you think something is not there and your imagery is very unvivid. And it should be higher when you think something is there and also you rate your imagery to be super vivid. So we're just trying to find patterns that we would expect the signal to show and then look at whether these brain regions were showing the same patterns. So first of all, in the interparietal sulcus, we did not find this pattern. Instead, we found this interesting interaction between stimulus presence and congruency, such that activity was kind of highest when the image and perception were incongruent with each other, which was surprising. I'm not going to go into detail here because there's too much. When you do neuroimaging, you will realize there's so many things you can look at, but we're just like, okay, move on for future directions. But when we looked in the fusiform gyrus, we found exactly the pattern that we predicted from our model. I was so happy when I saw this. I was like, that's so similar. And also here. And we also looked at the activity in the fusiform gyrus, and we could use this activity to predict on a trial-by-trial basis whether participants were going to think that what they were imagining was real. So when we looked at absent trials, and we just looked at the activation of the fusiform gyrus, we could predict if the activation of the fusiform gyrus was high enough, so imagery was strong enough, people would think that it was real. So that was really, really cool. And there were also individual differences in this effect. So people who showed a stronger effect of imagery on perception, we could also use this fusiform gyrus better to predict whether or not they were going to confuse the two. So we are now looking into whether this could predict things like hallucination proneness in participants. You know, are people who can overactivate their fusiform gyrus when they're imagining, are they more likely to get hallucinations? We don't know. So we're pretty clear, okay, this activity reality signal is maybe tracked by this fusiform gyrus, but in order to decide to distinguish between image and perception, it still needs to be compared against this kind of threshold, right? There needs to be a binary decision, this is real, this is imagined. And we looked at that in the brain by comparing the reality judgment parametric modulator with the vividness modulator to see which brain areas were better explained by this categorical judgment of real versus imagined. And we found this set of prefrontal regions. We then also showed that in each of these regions, activity was higher when people said they saw something real, irrespective of whether it was there and irrespective of what they were imagining. And we also found that especially the anterior insula over here was functionally coupled to the fusum gyrus in all conditions. So the way that we are thinking about this now, and this is very speculative, this research is very much ongoing, but one way in which the brain might be able to distinguish imagination and reality is by evaluating this kind of summary statistic of the vividness or the sensory strength of the signal, and then sending this to the prefrontal cortex to decide, is this high enough to cross my threshold? Yes or no. If it's high enough, I think it's real. Otherwise, I think it's imagined. If it's high enough, I experience it as real. Otherwise, I experience it as imagined. Now, most likely in daily life, there's other signals that the brain could use as well to distinguish between imagery and perception, right? So if there would be a super vivid pink elephant standing beside me, we'd probably think it's not real, just because pink elephants don't exist. So we are now in the lab looking at which other signals could the brain use to make this distinction. But we have shown that vividness seems to be one really important part of that story. So what I'd like you to take away from today's talk is that there is a problem that the brain needs to solve. We use the same machinery to simulate, to generate internal experiences as we do to process the outside world. And this is a problem that the brain needs to solve somehow. And we've suggested that one way in which it does this is by evaluating vividness. And we have found some evidence in favor of that idea. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to my collaborators as well.
Thank you very much for this excellent talk. We have time for a few questions.
Wow.
Let's start here.
Vicky, I was just wondering now, the last slides when you were mentioning the difference in the signal strength between imagined and real. Does anyone try to compare unconscious signal with imagined signal? And what makes the difference there? Is there like 3 levels or?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I've, in one of my studies during my PhD, tried to cross the code between unconscious perception and imagery, and then conscious perception and imagery. And I showed that I could only cross the code between conscious perception and imagery, not unconscious perception, but it was tricky because the signal was lower during unconscious perception. I don't know. So the way that the brain works, and this is why I think this is a reasonable idea, is that bottom-up signals, this is a little bit maybe unclear, but bottom-up signals drive activation patterns in the middle layer of the primary visual cortex, whereas top-down signals mostly just modulate existing activity levels. And that means that, by definition, almost all bottom-up signals will be stronger than top-down signals alone. So my intuition would be that unconscious signals might still be stronger than imagery. But what that, I have to think about it more. That's a cool question. I like it. Thank you.
That was fantastic. So I'm wondering what sets the criterion, and then can you pull up shifts in the criterion and shifts in strength?
Yes. Excellent question. No, we cannot, and I'm very annoyed about it because I would love to do that. I think there's so many things that could set this criterion. So now we're thinking about maybe this is something that the calibration happens in childhood. And that's why children experience their imagination as so vivid, even though they don't have the machinery to generate super vivid imagery yet, but maybe it's just because their threshold is not calibrated yet. Well, wild idea. Or the environment, like if you're in a foggy, road at night, your threshold should probably be lower, right? Because there's less signal, so you should assume something that's weaker is more real. I don't know how to pull the two apart. I don't know. If you have any ideas, let me know. We'd love to do that. It's definitely something we've been thinking about. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. I was wondering what you think about hierarchical models, because you always represent the visual cortex as like one region, but others think
it's not.
The hierarchical processing that you're reaching, which is related to the vividness.
Yeah. So I was so surprised that we found the fusum gyrus for vividness, right? Because these are gratings. So I would have expected the early visual cortex, like a much more low-level region. We did some decoding analysis in early visual cortex, and we could decode imagery even when nothing was presented, but it wasn't related to vividness or to reality judgments. So it's very speculative, and I'd love to have your opinions if you have any ideas, but we think that maybe you need this kind of high-level summary statistic that encompasses the whole object as something to evaluate about whether it's real or not. Maybe it doesn't make sense to decide whether a line is real or like parts of the object. Maybe you need this more holistic representation. That's kind of where I'm at with that, but yeah, good question.
I'm going to start with the part in the room. Maybe the student has a question. Also, I don't know if you get present to question. Do feel free.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You talked about intention. You didn't talk about attention. It's a major factor, so that we can distinguish.
Yeah. Super good question. So we are now actually thinking about implementing this reality monitoring in predictive processing models. And the way we're doing that is that you decide whether something is real or not based on the precision of your sensory signals. And when you pay attention to something, you make it more precise. So there's lots of evidence that, if I'm looking at this and I'm attending this, then in my visual cortex, the signals become stronger. They're like, they're more there. So that would all tie together. So that would suggest that when we are attending to something, we're more likely to think it's real. I don't know if that's the case yet. This is a theoretical idea. We should do investigations on that, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Some question on there.
So, for a quick talk, if you ever wake up in the morning and have just crammed up your alarm bell, then you know that thinking of something as real has consequences. And I'm wondering, how do you distinguish between when you see these kind of reality-dependent effects? How do you distinguish between the realization of reality and the process leading up to that and the consequences? Like if I see something as real, I explore it more, I study it more, I attend to it more.
Good question. I don't.
Yeah.
So it's a really good question. So there's for the students in the room, this is a super common debate in the neural correlates of consciousness. How do you know that these neural correlates are prerequisites for being conscious or not? Like your heart needs to be beating for you to be conscious. Doesn't mean that your heartbeat is a neural correlate of consciousness. Or it's a consequence of you being conscious. When you are conscious, you might act on things. And if you're unconscious, you might not act on things. So maybe your neural correlates are about the action, not about the experience itself. And you could say the same thing about reality judgments. I don't know, we have not started teasing those apart yet. So more research is needed. One thing could be that maybe those visual correlates are more to do with the experience and the frontal regions are more to do with the consequence, but I don't know. Could be either, could be anything. It's an important question.
How to find it out?
More questions? Well, many more questions. We start here and then you can pass them.
I think it's great talk. I'm curious about the image generation and the perception. So I think one slide you show for the perception, you really see something, there are signals up, and for picture down. So I'm curious if they go a different way or they just have different reference. Like for imagery, signals always less, and for the real thing you see is always up, or for imagery, it's actually go down, and for the real thing, it's go up.
So I'm just trying to figure out if I fully understand. Are you asking if there's different populations for imagery and perception, or if there's some signals that go up for imagery that go down for perception and the other way around? Yeah, is that?
The thing is negative and positive relationship, or just they have different stress or things?
Yeah, so I think for the sensory strength, it is just one directional relationship where it's like perception is almost always going to be higher than imagery. So you can just, which is also why it's very hard to confuse perception for imagination, except in Perky's 1910, but it's not something that we really do, right? We don't really think that what we're seeing is imagined usually. But there might be other signals like, cognitive control that's stronger during imagery than during perception. So that might show an opposite relationship that if you have, so maybe if you have more dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity, you're less likely to think something is real. I don't know. That's there are other signals that we can think about. Yeah. So I just think it's like a complicated process, and there's many things that could be going on. But yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to talk to some extent about the judgmental
judgment of reality, it depends on how vivid the imagery is in the piece or varies. And some people have it more vivid, some people have it less vivid. So are there any individual differences? For example, do some people on a stable basis see very vivid images?
Yeah.
And then probably correlate with hypnosis
Yeah.
or I don't know, attention control.
Super good question. Yeah, so there are massive individual differences. I mean, you saw it even when I asked the group, right? Some people were like, yeah, pretty vivid. Other people were like, nah. So there are super big individual differences. Now, there's two ways in which this could work. When your imagery is more vivid, your sensory strength is higher during imagination, but you might adjust for that by setting your threshold higher. So it might be that people with really vivid imagination also have a higher reality threshold. So and then that's why they don't hallucinate. Right? That's a possibility. But there are some studies that show correlates between imagery vividness and hallucination proneness. So people generally with more vivid imagination tend to be a little bit more likely to develop hallucinations and psychosis. But the evidence is a bit mixed. And it could be mixed because they don't take into account the threshold. That's one of our hypotheses. Now, another thing that's really interesting is aphantasia, which is people who can't imagine anything. They don't see anything when they imagine an apple. They're like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about, seeing with the mind's eye. It's like, I have some idea of an apple, but I don't actually see anything. Now, initially, we thought that the reason for that is because they can't activate their visual cortex. But in the last 2 years, the whole field got turned upside down because all these studies show that they can decode imagery from the visual cortex in people with aphantasia. Wild, I know. But maybe what's actually going on is that their reality monitoring is just really good. So they explain away every internally generated signal. So their threshold is just like, nah, it's nothing. And then that's why they explain away any experience. So bit of a monologue here, but that's, that's how we're thinking about it. Thank you.
So my question is related to that. So you mentioned your research had implications for the hallucination studies. Were you talking about cases of people suffering from schizophrenia, or do you also think this has implications for hallucinations during the influence of certain?
So yeah, it's a really good question. I think with schizophrenia, so okay, let me first answer this in a broad sense. I think knowing which brain mechanisms determine whether you experience something as real or not has an impact on all of those, has an influence on all of those things, right? Because in both those cases, people experience things that aren't real as real. So understanding how that works in the brain would have implications for our understanding of both of those processes. Now, personally, I study visual imagery and perception, and schizophrenia is generally associated with auditory hallucinations. So in that sense, I think, you know, similar mechanisms might be at play, but we would really need to do more follow-up research to make that link. Psychedelics, I always struggle with because it's like, as you can see, I try to control my experiments really well, which is why I get really boring stimuli, and psychedelics is like, I don't know what's going on. So I find it really hard to think about that because of that. We are now looking at Parkinson's patients, actually, because I didn't know this, but 40 to 50% of Parkinson's patients have really vivid visual hallucinations. Like, it's apparently a super common symptom in Parkinson's. And also people who have visual hallucinations tend to later have worse outcomes. So it seems to be quite an important part. And we are now checking, like, are these Parkinson's patients more likely to confuse their imagery for perception? And it seems to be the case. So to be continued.